Last time that we met live, I began discussing intimate relationships, and I didn't get very far into it, but we began discussing family, and at that time, I showed you, well, first of all, I directed you to look at these things from your book, and we talked a little bit about the second shift and began looking at the differences in the amount of time that men and women spend on these various tasks. So you'll want to go back and look at that. I don't believe we had the time to look at this chart quite so much, so I'd like to take just a quick moment for us to do that. As you'll see here, whether people have children or not, we're seeing in heterosexual relationships, and this is data, by the way, from 2016, you'll see down here, right? We see that women far and away, whether with children or whether the couple has children or not in these heterosexual relationships, are doing much more in the way of, as you see here, meal prep and grocery shopping. And if you're wondering how these numbers work out, because they don't always add up to 100, and there are some discrepancies here, what it has to do with is these are self-reports. So women are asked, how often are you the usual meal prepper? Right, and when you have of those of you who have kids, and 80% of women said they are, and 10% of the women said we just about equal. Men thought that they were in the same situation, thought they were equal about 20% of the time, right, and seeing that but that they themselves only do about 19%. So we're seeing two things there. The most important of them is the fact that even by self-report, as we're looking here, and then again as we look down here, we're seeing that women are tasked much more with this work than men are, whether they have children or not. What we are seeing a difference is that men are estimating that they do more than women estimate they do in terms of whether or not they are, sharing the workload. And who's right about that? I don't know, but I'm just saying that men do seem to be reporting that at a higher rate than women do. Do with that information what you will, but it is worth noting, though, these differences, right? And that second shift we talked about before of women being responsible or engaging in work in the home after they come home from their jobs is something we see even when the father, when they have children, even when the father is what we call a stay-at-home dad. That's what that stands for, stay-at-home dad. It looks sad, but it's this stay-at-home dad. So we see women doing that. And there is a little part of me that thinks, these men are smart. Not like, ha-ha, we checked those ladies. But more like, these are men who say, listen, just because I'm at home all day doesn't mean I have to do all of this. When you come home, you can also help me with these things. And so, maybe it's part of where men have it figured out more. I don't know. I wouldn't go too far with that, though. Right? So, about staying at home. One of the issues of anybody who is this, right, stay at home, right, is the question of when does your shift end? Because if one of you leaves the house at 7:30 and returns at 5:30, clearly your work shift ends. And so if you say, maybe reflecting on how you were raised, that my, male, and if it was heterosexual, and I don't know if there were two, but if you say, well, it worked really well, because for many people, right, my dad went to work, and my mom, she stayed at home, and you took care of all the stuff at home while he was off working. Okay, but then when did her shift end, right? When did, if she was the one at home doing all that work, when did her time at work end? Oldenburg is a sociologist, and he writes about first, second, and third places. The first place is the home. The second place is where we work. And the third places are places of leisure. And actually, that's his book, is The Great Good Places. I'm not going to talk about that. Talk about the first and second place. And Oldenburg recognizes, when he talks about the first and second places, the challenge for women who stay at home, at the first place, their home, and the second place, their job, are the same place. They don't leave their job, right? So that's one of the challenges for anybody who stay at home, is understanding when their shift end. But we do see that for stay-at-home dads and stay-at-home moms, the stay-at-home dads put in less hours of domestic labor, and in fact, the wives of stay-at-home dads will do more domestic labor than the husbands of stay-at-home moms. right? So that's something important to know. One of the other patterns that comes up quite a bit in your book, I believe, makes some reference to this. I'm trying to recall all the different passages from there right off the top of my head. But it talks about the difference, in touching on, of the roles in the household of manager versus worker. And so some of you may have had the opportunity or the experience of being a manager at, say, it's a shift manager or manager at a store, right? But being a manager at a job. And you know that when you're a manager, things are different, because when you're a manager, you have certain responsibility. And that is, you have to make sure things get done, right? First, you have to remember a thing has to be done. Then you have to make sure that somebody's going to do it. And you have to follow to make sure that somebody's got it done. Right? That's the role of a manager. Right? And this was hinted at in the presentation we had on housework by Diddle and Micah. And that was discussed or touched on briefly, right, that women felt that often they were in the position of having to nag. And that's when as a manager, you may not, at work, you may or may not feel yourself nagging sometimes, saying, please, I asked you to go and make sure you restock the stuff. We got to have that done before the shift ends, right? Like, you're asking again. And by the way, if you're tired of asking people to do things, never raise a child. Okay, right. But there is that responsibility to remember it has to be done, to assign the task, to follow to make sure it's done. It's a responsibility of a manager. And women often find that in a heterosexual household, right, they take on that responsibility. And they then feel like they're nagging, constantly pestering, reminding, please, I asked you, unload the dishwasher or put the laundry away, and right, and they feel like they're nagging. So first they have the responsibility of, again, make sure it gets done, assigning it, following up, but then also feel that when they're giving these reminders, they're nagging. And we have studies of heterosexual couples of men saying, I'm glad to help around the house, right? They're glad to help around the house, to assist, rather than seeing that as being their obligation as a member in the house. They see themselves as merely assisting, apparently, her, right? And thinking about that language, right? Help, that I help out around the house. If you say that I help out around the house, suggests that it's not really your job. You're just sort of being a nice person by pitching in and doing it, right? And so then women feel that they are responsible for it, and they're nagging. And husbands have said in some of these studies, well, she should just remind me. But then that puts the onus and the burden on her. And again, she feels like she's the stereotype of the nagging woman or the nagging wife. We also have this question then of what sort of labor is being valued, right? What sort of labor are we ultimately valuing here? And often we don't value domestic labor. It's sort of unimpressive, and really short of preparing, or I guess just buying prepared food, and some very basic hygiene things like making sure there aren't like maggots and gnats in the home. There's not a whole lot that really has to be done. We can get away with a lot of things not being done around the house. It's just seen as so basic as well that we end up not valuing it the way we have a tendency to value what is paid labor. And so we have then as an association of women and women's work with labor that we generally don't value, hold as being very skilled or very important or always even entirely necessary, even though when it doesn't happen, like the house is never dusted or mopped or anything, we do notice it doesn't feel quite as good, but the doing of it we don't value the same way we do often those others are sort of paid labor. As we're talking about then men and women in the household, I want to talk about fathers for a moment and say that yes, dads do care about being fathers. This is probably not a real surprise to a lot of people, but we look at this Pew data, and as you'll see here, this is actually from 2015. Moms and dads rate almost equally that being a parent is extremely important to their identity. Dads actually find it slightly more rewarding than mothers, but by this very negligible amount of, all of 2% there. And dads actually rate parenting as enjoyable all of the time, 5% more than moms. That may be a difference in the kind of parenting they're doing. That, if you consider parenting more of getting on the floor with the kids and playing around, or is parenting also like nagging them to brush their teeth, That might explain part of that, perhaps. I don't know. I just want to say, I don't even know. I'm sorry, 40% enjoy it all of the time? I can't say that I enjoy parenting all the time. I love being a parent, but do I enjoy it all the time? No, I'd be out here in this giant white space we're not supposed to talk about. It's hard. It's hard. Okay, that's right. Wouldn't trade it for anything. Except for some days. So dads do care, but if we look at a study by Borkovist et al., and by the way, sometimes in papers I see people, students will put et al. When there's even just a second author. In this case, I think there are about 5 authors or so. So it's when you have a goodly number of authors use et al. But Borkovist et al. From 2020, just from this year, the study found that dads do care, and dads do actually say they want to be involved in the raising of their children. They did interviews with men. Not all the time, no. Okay, so the fathers often saw themselves in talking about the care of their children, especially their very, very young children. Fathers often saw themselves as being helpers, saying they really wanted to help their partner. They really wanted to support her. They really wanted to lend a hand. So they saw themselves as helpers, which went then to reify the mother as the primary parent, as the one who was naturally expert at it and naturally obligated to do it. Actually, some fathers they would use statements in the study, say things like, I want to get up and do a lot of things at night, but gosh, I'm just such a heavy sleeper. Oh, should she wake you up then? Of course, then it's her nagging, right? But, it's like, yeah, okay, well, guess what? You learn to not be when you have to do it. Sorry, I'm not trying to be too crabby here. But the fathers, a lot of times, they saw themselves as helpers and sort of made these excuses about things like, well, I'm just such a heavy sleeper, as being why they couldn't get up and do these things, or she's just so much better at it than I am. They use those excuses. By the way, that parallels a study from 30 years ago that looked at the ways that men avoided doing housework. So here we are, same sort of thing. The fathers reported, though, that in terms of being fully involved parents, they actually felt certain barriers. One was work. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But yeah, they felt that work that wasn't something that it wasn't recognized as much in the workplace. They could take time off to go and care for their children, be with their children, attend children's events, and so forth. But there were also other social barriers, or social structural barriers. Here I've just said social cues. The men reported going to events for their children, or maybe trying to take the child to the park, and having the experience of noticing that they were the only male parent, that all the rest were mothers or other women bringing the children, and they felt that they were out of place, and in fact the men felt that they were being looked at. They may have been, they may not have been, but the men went there and suddenly felt that they were the odd one out. And think about, whenever you're the odd one out, people may or may not be looking at you, but you certainly feel it. And so the men then felt that there were social cues, and social barriers just made it where when they did do the things to be more engaged and involved, even just showing up to kids' events or taking the children to the park, when they saw that they were the only male and or father there doing that, they felt suddenly that they were out of place. They recognized that as being a barrier. It made them just less excited and less likely to go and to do those things. And I can say, I know they're talking about being the only dad there, and wondering if people are looking at you. And after all, I noticed that I didn't know the women were looking at me all that much when I was the only one there taking my daughter to the music time at the library when I was not working and she was not in daycare. And they had this sort of music and movement thing when she was little. But I also noticed that the women weren't really engaging with each other either, and how much that I was the only dad there, but they weren't really looking at me any differently than they were looking at each other, which is everybody sort of looking at each other askance and a lot of distance and isolation. So sort of sad all around. But anyway, that was these fathers, what they said they felt and saw, and it's fair enough and legitimate. And in terms of men being at home and being stay-at-home fathers, the talk of men as stay-at-home fathers sometimes, in some of the data, overhypes how much men are actually stay-at-home dads. So when we look at this blue line right here, it shows the stay-at-home mothers, and this line shows the stay-at-home fathers. And we see there's a peak here in 2010 of 9% versus, let's see, that would have been 21 years earlier of only 4% in 1989. But those weren't so much stay-at-home fathers, right, as those were dads who were staying at home, right? Because if you look here, it says the dotted line shows shares excluding those who were home because they could not find work. So these of these 9% you have right here, right, 3% of those were men. They weren't so much stay-at-home fathers as they were men who were at home because they were just the fathers who were at home. So the number of stay-at-home fathers has doubled since 1989, but all the way to 2016, which is, what is that? 27 years later, it's gone from 3% to 6%. And for mothers, that number has remained stable. Yeah. So there are more men at home than there used to be, but overall, when we're talking about stay-at-home parents, it is largely stay-at-home mothers and not stay-at-home fathers. That's not a judgment of any sort necessarily, but recognizing we have certain patterns that are established. And something to consider is why is it, how's that happen? And there's a whole lot of factors, and we're not going to do a full dive into it here, but it's something worth considering is what are the factors that lead to this. So as we're talking about men at home, a study by Fisher and Anderson from 2012 was looking at stay-at-home dads versus, for lack of better terms here, working dads, right? The dads who were not staying at home. And by the way, I only consider myself to have ever briefly been sort of a stay-at-home dad, more so with Eleanor than with Grant when she was a newborn. I was at home alone with the child for a semester while Ivy was back at work full-time. I say alone, I mean during the day. But I still was employed, and I would be gone. I would teach still 1 day a week, and so 1 day a week, Ivy and her or her parents would care for Eleanor. So I was only sort of a stay-at-home dad at one point. Just FYI, I never really did. I sort of had a taste of it, and it was wonderful and challenging all at the same time. But what they found was that stay-at-home dads versus working dads, stay-at-home dads versus the working dads, had greater scores of egalitarianism. And you may remember from our chapter on religion, egalitarianism versus complementarianism. Right? Complementarianism says women and men have different roles, versus egalitarianism says women and men have like the same roles, right? Same roles, responsibilities, etc., as opposed to different, right? And so stay-at-home dads, as opposed to working dads, had higher scores for egalitarianism. But the scores on, feminine traits or masculine traits, you didn't see a difference there. There wasn't really a difference in so the idea that our stay-at-home dads, men who just have more feminine traits, in terms of self-report, at least, looking at self-report, that wasn't showing. What made the difference was that more likely a stay-at-home dad was going to be somebody who thought that women and men had the same jobs and opportunities and certain positions and families and society and so forth than did working dads. But it didn't really seem to make a difference whether they were more masculine or more feminine.